It's about history. It's about preservation. It's about sense of place here on Eastern Long Island. With Esperanza Leon, I'm Irwin Levy, and this is Our Hamptons. Esperanza.
Irwin, hello. Today I felt sing-song.
Oh, you did the sing-song today.
Yes, because I'm excited about what we're going to talk about.
I'm excited about this one on so many levels.
Esperanza.
Exactly. So many levels. And this is something Esperanza and I always have our little dialogue before we press record. But actually, I didn't even mention this to Esperanza, and I probably should have. But part of it is this particular person deserves so much more attention than she gets.
Absolutely.
Her accomplishments are extraordinary, and we're going to get to them. While this Esperanza, suffice to say, is a Wainscott story, and it is, but it's far bigger than that, right?
Oh, 100%. Yes.
Now, who are we talking about?
Who are we talking about?
Okay, tell our audience.
So we are talking about Elizabeth Barlow Rogers, who is familiarly known as Betsey.
Okay.
And everywhere I've read that she was known as the savior of Central Park.
And that's exactly where we're going to start before we get into more of a Wainscott perspective with Elizabeth Barlow Rogers. So it says, and this is something we've done in our Hamptons in the past. Sometimes we start a little bit present day, future, whatever, and backtrack a little bit, and we're doing that now. But for those in our audience, now this is a headline that resonates with me. There was a time in New York City, circa 1970s, when New York City was not the sanitized version of what it is now.
Well, yeah, and now is kind of questionable, isn't it? But it's much better.
We're going back to the future a little bit now with some of the things pandemic related and everything else. Very true. But
yes.
There was a point in New York City, and I'm going back to the 1970s, and this is really, for me, this is when I was 18, 19 years old, really coming of age kind of time for me. There was a daily news headline. Esperanza was a little girl at the time, but she probably knows the headline. It was a daily news tabloid headline: Ford to City drop dead. And it was all about how then President Ford denied funding. New York City was in the throes of an enormous financial crisis, et cetera, and so on. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but it is important to give that background because of this financial crisis. New York City was sort of in the throes of a lot of problems. And Central Park was one of those problems. And in 1979, then Mayor Ed Koch appointed Elizabeth Barlow Rogers to the newly created position of the Central Park administrator. And at the time, and I'm going to use Elizabeth Barlow's own words here, how we had great devastation in Central Park. There was graffiti everywhere. Garbage overflowed after concerts. The park, in her words, was near death.
Yeah. And I think prior to that appointment, she had created sort of a coalition of volunteers that were trying to combat this death of the park, which, was a park, as we know, created by Frederick Law Olmsted and
That's
Calvert
right.
Vaux, who, were called upon by the people of New York in the 19th century. It was the people's park.
Completely true. And again, she helped found the Central Park Conservancy. And this really, we can't minimize this part of the story. It changed everything.
Yeah.
Central Park was just, like much of New York City, it was
devastated.
Yeah. It was unsafe.
Yep.
Lawns were basically dirt. There was trash everywhere. There was graffiti all over the place. It was just, and again, appointed by Mayor Koch, working with then New York City Parks Commissioner Gordon Davis, they really conceived a master plan. And
Right.
she was a big part of this plan to restore Central Park. And look, this is a very accomplished woman to begin with. I mean, she's a landscape preservationist. She's written numerous books, essays, but suffice to say, this city, this country owes a debt of gratitude to her.
You took the words right out of my mouth.
I
Yes.
mean,
I
this is,
mean, I think worldwide people learned from what she did with Central Park.
I think that's a
It's not
fantastic.
an understatement.
No, I was just going to say that is not an understatement. This is a very serious hour. We're starting here. I mean, but to Esperanza's point, it can't be understated. It was
Yeah.
This place was a disaster, and through the efforts of someone like this, it was so important to her. This is a gift for the world.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and to your point, Esperanza, an example for the world.
Yes, yeah. And let's not forget. I mean, this was her adopted city. I mean, she like had such a love for New York, but she was not a native New Yorker. She's had come from Texas
That's correct.
and had just she had just, I guess, came to love New York so much that this was very important to her.
Just, yeah. And by the way, she's still alive, and I'm sure
Yes.
this work is still resonating, with her. She was born in 1936. So if, in my math, that's making her 87 years old, I believe, since we're in 2013, if I think I'm correct there. So, but yes, she's still here. But Esperanza, and again, this is a subject really near and dear, not only to, yes, to me and to our Hamptons, but, it's also probably a little more personal for Esperanza as a Wainscott resident and as her work with Wainscott Heritage Project, which we've spoken of many times before on our Hamptons.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I didn't know anything about this person, until I had friends who were living in a cottage that was on her property. And one day, our children were playing and they said, "Oh, let's go back into the garden."
Right.
I said, "What?
Right.
What garden?" And then I kind of got a glimpse of who she was.
Another amazing segue, because
Thank
it's a
you.
perfect, yeah, she's, over the course of the body of work of our Hamptons, I'm not even going out on a limb here. Esperanza Leon's segue skills are just like, it's off the charts at this point. We're sort of, look, we always make this running joke how we finish each other's sentences here, and I mean, I guess that's sort of true, but we really do have to bring it to Wainscott and Esperanza, a Wainscott that, another theme we've spoken of on our Hamptons, that sweet spot of the 60s, the 70s, like when really
on the East End. Yeah. Yeah.
when it was really
Still a farming community, really.
yes.
Farming, fishing.
Yes.
She, in fact, as an author, one of her books early on is, and you have this book as well, is East Hampton, A History and Guide, that she co-wrote with Jason Epstein.
That's right.
And I still learn so much from that book.
It's a book it's almost a book like you can read like a novel, yet it's a reference book.
So it's a reference. Exactly. Yes.
It's really interesting. But when you're fascinated by the subject matter,
and she clearly was also
completely true. And what's really amazing about this, we're taking a lot of this story, I mean, virtually all of it, really from her own website, her own blog post that Esperanza, this was written in January of 2023.
Yes.
I mean, this is really current. And we're going to really talk about what she says, because it says so much of who she is and what Wainscott meant to her. And I'm going to be honest with our Hamptons audience. Esperanza and I have both read this a few times. I'm telling you, my eyes watered.
Yes, it's so moving.
It's just, she's the most, really is. Her writing is just so beautiful. And, we're going to give you the oral, verbal, whatever interpretation of it. We encourage you to read it too, because the words are just so moving. But we should probably start just briefly. We're going to give a little bit of the cast of characters. We always like to do that. So we do have Elizabeth Barlow Rogers. We do have her husband, Ed Barlow.
Her first husband.
Correct. Yeah. Thank you, Esperanza. Lisa Barlow, her daughter.
His son, I think, David. Also.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there are a couple of neighbors that are going to come into play. Mrs. Emmett's kids, Rachel and Ralph, and how that's Mrs. Emmett's daughter and son-in-law, and also play a really prominent role, which we'll get to soon, was her immediate neighbor, sort of to the rear, not really parallel, the Tices. But I'm really going to start really with how almost her opening line to this blog, which really states, and remember, another big theme of our Hamptons podcast, put yourself here, come with us to this time when in 1965, Elizabeth Barlow Rogers, Barlow at the time, and her family bought a small second home built circa 1906. And as she described it, it resembled a children's picture of a house.
It's so true.
Yeah, and if you see the house, we've seen this house. We've been on this property. We'll tell you about it.
It still exists, fortunately, on Sayers Path.
It still exists on Sayers Path, which is one of the sweetest streets in Wainscott South, running off of Wainscott Main Street. Actually goes all the way to 27, but this is on the southern portion of it. But that would have been, and this is her words, such would have been an approximate portrait of the farmhouse, which together with its elongated lawn and far back scrub woods, constituted the 2.5-acre property that they purchased in 1965 for $29,000. Now, Elizabeth was 29, her husband was 30, they had a 7-year-old daughter, and she referred to herself like other New York families. They were summer vacationers, weekended travelers, but they were going to the country because this was the predominantly rural eastern end of Long Island.
Yeah. People, I know people who still call it coming to the country, but it's so much less so now. But yes.
Yeah, and we've even touched on this. Yes, I mean, we know we're a world-class resort in the summer, and maybe in the winter we sort of morph back to more of our roots when it's a little quieter. And again, she even puts this, Esperanza, how, and especially specific to Wainscott, this was not associated with the poshness and haunt of celebrities. There were no celebrities in
of
Wainscott.
The Hamptons. No.
Esperanza, I'm going to ask you, I don't think there were celebrities in Wainscott in 1965.
Well, I would say there might have been notable people. Okay. Like I know for a fact, Frank Lloyd Wright, his sister lived here. So, but it wasn't, this was never this glorification of the stardom that it is today. Yeah.
Nor another common
or wealth.
True. And another common theme of our Hamptons. Wainscott circa 1965 was in no way, shape, or form resembled the bookends of Southampton and East Hampton villages. This was farmland. And I got to say, Esperanza, this quote, and, full disclosure, we researched this. I mean, there are things I underline, highlight, because it just, the words, just the way she said this, how she fell in love with their modest second home in this farming community. And Wainscott, and this is her description, more than simply a getaway close to one of the most beautiful beaches in the world. Oh God, these words. And thousands of acres of potato fields beneath a sky softened by the luminous Atlantic atmosphere.
Yeah.
Excuse me, I have to go get some tissues now.
I know, because the light was different. It really was. We talk about the light and the artists talk about the light, but the light really was.
The light was different. And this was the light with no screening and arborvitae.
Exactly. And humongous houses just completely obliterating that luminosity. Yeah.
Right. And the view sheds that we wax nostalgic for were there.
Yeah.
And all of that reflecting off of an Atlantic, whatever. I mean, from Sayers Path, whatever it was, a third of a mile away. And
probably along with the DDT and stuff like that. But it just
we're not going down that road. We try to keep that. Very, very good.
I'm totally in jest. No, this, we
No,
don't want to be too like romanticize
right,
this,
right.
but it really, I mean, I remember this, it wasn't much different 10 years later.
No, no. And yeah, to Esperanza's point, I mean, you just heard her say it. I mean, she, from living here, uh, these memories are still in her mind as a little girl, as a girl growing up, the preteen, whatever, remembers. So, not ancient history.
Right.
Not ancient history. And, and now she touches, I mean, I just love this. She even touches on the Georgia Association. Now, remember, Sayers Path, and we've had an episode we did a couple of episodes about Wainscott, and we touched on the Georgia Association. That membership community, gated then, gated now, restricted to the owners of those beautiful 19th century shingled houses.
A little more
Kilcare,
accessible back then, I think.
I would think. I think that's right, but with the sponsorship of the head of the legal firm in New York, where her husband was an attorney, they were admitted as members, and their little family, their daughter, they played tennis on those tennis courts with the windmill there.
Yes.
And just they went into the bathhouse with the lifeguards. So they even were part of it, part of the association. You always bring up that book, Jeff, what's his name?
Oh, Jeff Gaiman.
Jeff Gaiman.
Yeah. Kingdom of the Kid. And he talks about, you riding your bike everywhere in Wainscott and going into the association and hanging out. And
right.
Yeah.
And Jeff didn't live in the association proper either,
Nope.
but yet was part of it.
He was around the corner from Betsey.
And some of the people you work with on Wainscott Heritage Project relay those stories also.
Yes,
they took their
absolutely.
bikes in there
Exactly.
while not being part of it. But again, she continues to wax nostalgic, discussing Sagaponack, the village right next door in Southampton town. Before, again, touching on this, and there's a point, we're going to get to this because it's going to tie together as we move along, but before it became celebrity real estate, it was potato fields introduced really early 20th century by the Polish immigrants that farmed those lands from Wainscott to Sagaponack, Bridgehampton, the Ostremskys, and all of the others, the Hoppings, the Hands, the Hedges, Pearsons, Osborns. I mean, royalty, Esperanza. I mean,
yeah,
Wainscott royalty. But speaking specifically of her earliest, God, I love these stories. Here I go with my redundancy again. I reprimanded myself for redundancy on an episode or two prior, but I'm going to do it again. I can't help it. Esperanza, in her genteel manner, said, "Oh, when redundancy is a good thing, even though
yeah. Repetition is good. Got to make your point.
We have to make our point." But she relays, and again, we want to transport everybody to this era, 1960s Wainscott. What this place was, and she goes back. A Mrs. Emmett, an elderly woman who lived directly across Sayers Path from me in the small cottage that backed onto the large potato field owned by David Osborne.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh. That potato field, Esperanza.
That field is still there.
It is still there.
The cottage, no.
the cottage, no, but the field is still there. Okay.
Yeah. A lot of the cottages are still there, but this one I think is not.
But to take you into what life was like on the street for these, this young family. I mean, these, again, in the early 30s at this point, Mrs. Emmett and her deceased husband were employed as domestic staff for a wealthy New York family. Now, suffice to say, domestic staff circa 2023 can't afford to live on Sayers Path. Okay.
Yeah, no.
Or anywhere else for that matter. But
yeah,
again,
they're lucky if they can come from, Riverhead.
Yeah, right. But yet they were employed as domestic staff and were able to live on Sayers Path. And so it was she's talking about how they worked during the summer in their employer's home, either in the Georgia Association or maybe somewhere else in East Hampton. So, and again, to this point, Esperanza, when it came time for them to retire, they were able to buy that cottage.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then they later acquired these were
working class people.
Yes. Working class people.
This was that neighborhood. Exactly.
They were able to live there.
And let's not forget that the Barlows then, purchased this house and just settled right into the farmhouse and their 2.5 acres
That's right.
and did not knock anything down.
No, no, no.
Because that's not what we did back
that
then.
is not what was, that was not what was done back then.
Nope.
There was a respect that is just
Totally. I mean, you added, 2 bathrooms to your second story, to get rid of the outhouse. That was
that's what you
the
did.
amenity at the time.
And you immersed yourself in the community that was,
Yes.
rather than try to change it into something that it was not.
Right.
And to that point, Esperanza, and in her own words, Elizabeth Barlow Rogers saying, the character of the street at that time was still mostly a working class one, and its residents included Mr. Niggles, the motor vehicle mechanic whose repair services in his backyard garage included patching punctured bicycle tires and performing other fix-ups for the trusty Raleigh that took me to and from the beach each day.
I mean, magnificent. Don't you love it that you could just go to your neighbor and say, hey, Mr. Niggles, can you patch up my bicycle? Like,
I mean,
you can't even knock on a door these days. Nobody's home.
That's well, first of all, the place is gated. You can't even get through it.
Right. I forgot to,
but
push through the hedge.
Just again, I mean, go back and think. And Esperanza, again, we're not, to use another famous term on Our Hamptons podcast, ancient history. Okay, we're talking, yes. All right, we're talking 58 years ago, whatever, 60s. We're not talking 1860 here. I mean, this is...
Right. Yeah.
I was alive here during this period of time. This is not that far away. It's just hard to believe. And here, look, to your point, we're talking about when Mrs. Emmett's kids were remodeling the house.
Right, because they purchased the Barlow, the farmhouse was first the Emmets, right? I mean, they purchased it for their daughter.
That's right.
That's right.
That's right. And this is just the point, Esperanza. She segued without even realizing it. They did some work inside the house that made it possible for them to tear down the outhouse. That was what renovations were. They converted the space, just Esperanza just said this, into bathrooms. They were able to tear down an outhouse. They weren't interested in 7,800 square feet. They were interested in just living within this community.
Just a brief aside, the Wainscott Chapel is only just now tearing down the outhouse.
That's right.
We in Wainscott.
That is it. That is exactly right. And God, that is so true. I mean, we saw that, but oh my gosh, sorry for that pause, but I'm thinking about that. Just here,
it's just funny because it's. I mean, again, because don't want to romanticize, but it's
exactly.
Just,
but we're going to
all need indoor plumbing. We do.
Esperanza, if you recall, we actually met you last year. This is now, we're talking about 2022, at the Wainscott Chapel.
Yes.
For an ice cream social. So don't okay. So, and where that's part of the conversation was how we're getting rid of the outhouse. So yes, these are not fabrications. These are true stories we're talking about on our Hamptons podcast. But, and then she waxes nostalgic about how Lisa had a tree house that she named the treehouse Utopia that hung at the end of her deck. But
that's an idyllic childhood, right?
I mean, completely. Yeah. They again put that. The treehouse at the end of the property, the walking over to the Georgica Association and everything else. But Esperanza, here's the kind of thing I really loved, how when they looked back directly towards the end of the lawn, towards the entrance to the woodland garden, and they talk about a Bill Miller's tree service who fertilized things over the years. And in the 1980s, she was sort of creating her Central Park East garden to sort of mimic the work that was going on there. Because she had a beautiful garden. But now, this is one that really struck me. And Esperanza and I touched on it. She wanted to double the size of their back lawn to create an uninterrupted greensward. And the retired couple who lived, I guess, in the back was I
think it's the neighbor to the south.
To the south. Yeah. Okay. But thank you. I stand corrected. To the south, but adjacent. But a separate property, to be clear. because we're getting somewhere with this, right, Esperanza?
Yes. Yeah.
They wanted to double the size of this,
And
and
just the view, really. It wasn't like
yes,
they wanted to, take over land, like some kind of encroachment.
to give a little aside, when I lived up island in Great Neck on my small little .20 of an acre, my lawn rolled into my neighbor's lawn for all the years that those neighbors were there. And then the new neighbor bought the house just before we moved out and put up a 6-foot PVC fence on
Lovely.
our property line.
Yep.
And I just looked at that. Our lawn, again, this is when we didn't have a large one, but the lawn rolled into the next lawn without a fence.
And no, everybody respected the.
Right. But my neighbor, lovely family, very nice family, but, apparently wanted to incarcerate his children and lock them into
That's the way. That's the way today.
I guess. But anyway, sorry for that.
We're going.
Oh my God!
We're getting away from
podcast.
ourselves.
We really are. But I just thought of that right now.
No,
but
it's true.
But the point of the story was, they sort of Mrs. Elizabeth Rogers sort of wanted to expand her property without expanding the property. I mean, is it fair to say that, Esperanza?
Vista. It's expanding a vista, and it would benefit both. I mean, it wasn't like something that she wanted just for herself. It was something for Mrs. Tice as well. I feel like,
Exactly right. So she asked Mrs. Tice if she would allow them to make a more attractively curvaceous border for her bed of Hermocallis daylilies with its sweet woodruff ground cover and encroach upon Mrs. Tice's now, her tomatoes and cucumbers. And fortunately, Mrs. Tice gave me a gracious response, whereupon this part of the boundary line between our properties became a swinging loop.
Yeah. Yep. Which is, it's.
Oh my gosh. And it was now, and here's the point, and we're going to now get to when a little moment in time when Esperanza and I and a little group actually saw this property in the flesh last summer. But it was logical now to consider how the Tice's backyard, equal in size to mine, could be completely united if the low wire fence separating them were removed to allow our respective back lawns to coalesce into a single generous size greensward. And her lawn maintenance guy, teenage Danny Niggles next door, mowed the grass covering the united lawns. And Bill Miller's tree men pruned and fertilized all the trees on the now, and I love this line so much, consolidated properties.
Mm-hmm.
2.5 acres to all of a sudden they were on 5 acres together.
Yeah, nearly.
Together.
Yeah.
Together. Neighborly, just neighborly. And the story gets even better, Esperanza. It gets even better because then they did some work on this. Remember, now, just putting it in perspective, this was someone, working with landscape architects on the Central Park Conservancy. She knew how knew how to transform property.
This was parallel to the saving of Central Park, right? To saving it, to restoring it, to creating, restoring the ramble, restoring the sheep's meadow, all of that, correct?
Completely true.
Yeah.
And again, and not and to be clear, this was in no way, shape, or form, I'm bringing New York out here.
No. Like no
that.
Grand statement here.
No way. No way. This was just all about simplicity. But I mean, this is probably the most beautiful part of the story for me. In this specific part of how these two neighbors, and full disclosure, I write notes sometimes in these little outlines we prepare for Esperanza, and I'm writing in my words. Could you imagine this now? Because I couldn't.
And imagine this. I mean, everybody needs to picture this beautiful, she created on the 2.5 acres on the back acre, a woodland garden.
Exactly correct.
And a woodland garden that emulated over time the ramble in Central Park. Right. And she even brought in, as they would cut down, she and her husband would cut down pepbriar and, here's, some trees that need to be removed, just some locusts and things like that. But we're not just going to throw them in a scrap pile.
That's correct.
She brought in David Robinson,
That's right.
who had been working on rebuilding the arbors and gazebos and such structures that existed at Central Park. And she brought him in. And I'm just you picture this beautiful,
It's
romantic, I mean, talk about romantic place, right?
it's hard to describe,
And so now tell us.
but and as it turned out, the Tice's daughter came over one day and asked if it was all right if she and her fiance could get married in the Glen. The Glen, which essentially was what the two neighbors created together, shared space, whatever you want to call it. And yes, of course, she could get married in the Glen.
Yeah. Yeah. And
My
that,
gosh.
she aptly like christened the Glen, Mrs. Tice's daughter, and that's how it became known in the Barlow Rogers family, which is just neighborliness at its best, right?
That is, I can't add, that's a perfect way of putting it. Neighborliness at its best,
I mean,
community at
listen,
its best.
I got married in the nature trail on the street I grew up
Right,
on, and that thank you to Mrs. Woodhouse for having created that. But
that's
it was
exactly.
something like this, it was really something like this.
And we were fortunate enough, Esperanza and I think we did this with an East Hampton Trails. We did a walk with Wainscott Heritage Project and East Hampton Trails Preservation Society last year, where we walked Wainscott South with Wainscott Heritage, and we passed the Barlow property. And okay, full disclosure, we took a walk on it, took a look at it, and needless to say, anyone that was there that day was moved by being on that property, that sense
Yes.
of place, what was created. But
And this is like 2 years after it
that
hasn't even been maintained, right? I mean, that's
exactly right,
still
because
had
it's
that magic.
right, because and here's where we're going to start to wind this story down. And in Elizabeth Barlow Rogers' own words now, it is true that one can mourn for a beloved place almost as much as one mourns a deceased friend or family member. Yet sorrow has a particular sweetness, and memory palliates absence. And the words I have written here may be those of an obituary, but perhaps the house won't be torn down, nor the garden obliterated by the new owner. Because yes, Esperanza, the house is for sale, has been for sale. We all hope that this house is preserved, maintained. We would love CPF to buy it. We would love a buyer who would respect this property to buy it, but no one can predict such things.
Rather than a pickleball court being built in the Glen.
And she writes these words. And again, we encourage you to read this blog. We're just picking out a few of how she was going back to the property and how she took one last bicycle ride to the beach to say goodbye to the place where the terns nest beside Georgia Pond, while seagulls and sandpipers patrol the beach. She emptied the bag with shells and stones collected there and displayed on the windowsills in the house. I mean, could you imagine this? She came home, put the bike back in the shed, took a final stroll through the property. And it was then time to walk out to the front door to where the car was parked on the strip of grass between Sayers Path and the split rail front yard fence. Beautiful day. I swear to God, thank God. Only Esperanza is watching the tears going down my cheeks right now, thankfully. But it was a beautiful day, and the special autumn sunshine that gilds the landscape of Long Island's South Fork at this time of year bathed the front of the Wainscott house I had owned and loved for 54 years. Oh my God. So she's writing this in 2019 when she knew that the house, she's reflecting
She's
back.
reflecting back to 2019. Yeah,
right,
to 2019. Right. Yeah.
Right. And just all of these things. I mean, Esperanza there was nothing else to do now except to say goodbye to the tall oaks in front of the house and then to the house itself. I felt the door key on the key ring in my pocket and knew that I would never turn it in this lock again. And then she laments a theme. My gosh, have we discussed this on Our Hamptons, Esperanza? Hoping a worse realization than of new owners having a locksmith cut a new key for them was an assumption that since the house had now fallen into the category known as a teardown, it would be removed entirely. As a corollary, they might consider the garden a dig-up. My nightmare vision was there would be a mansion with a large car garage and a swimming pool, changing room with shower, and a nearby bar for party drinks and refreshments. But she had to stop thinking about those things because she closed this really by saying, no, at this point where I've turned a page in the story of my life, I will close this entry in my journal.
Yeah, it's another chapter in the life of Wainscott, isn't it? You know,
I mean, this was a 54-year reflection in a blog post.
Yeah, it just, you know, very quickly I'm thinking just how, you know, how differently people enjoy life these days. Where in the past you would just, you know, get on your bicycle, go to the beach. I remember bicycle and a towel. That was my bathing suit on, you know, and that was it.
That's
nowadays,
how she went to the beach. Yeah.
Exactly. Nowadays it's just all, I mean, there's so many accoutrement, you know, like so many things that go with enjoying life. You know, if you have to have the right technology, you have to have the right garage, you have to have the right pool.
Yeah, is there Wi-Fi at the beach?
Is there Wi-Fi at the beach? Exactly, because what would we do without Wi-Fi at the beach?
And you know, and you just look, and Esperanza, these are not old themes for our Hamptons. We've discussed this when we spoke.
Well, I mean, it makes me sound like a Luddite, you know. I know,
we are.
I'm like, I'm not a dinosaur. I don't eschew technology, but it's just a simpler way of enjoying things.
And again, it touches on, yes, Paul Goldberger, we're not a museum frozen in time. Yes, Sag Harbor, where sense of community is changed there, and Leisure-Rama and Montauk Shores and all the rest that we've discussed. Yes, everything changes.
Change is the constant. Yeah.
I mean, it's the constant. We can't do anything about that, but
can we be more sensitive?
And Esperanza, is it fair to say, and I know we really have to start wrapping this up, but this one's hard to say goodbye to. This one really seems to, I don't know if it was the beauty of the writing, you know, the visual of
and the recollection. Yes, all of it together.
The sensitivity from a mind like this.
Of a landscape preservationist of all people, right?
Yeah. You can put this so eloquently, in such a moving way, but I was transported back to Wainscott circa 1960s and 70s. Yes. And that light off of the farm field glistening off of the ocean just...
Yeah. And so going back to the celebrities of Wainscott, to me, Betsey Barlow Rogers, she's the celebrity.
Oh my gosh. That's...
Yeah.
We have to close on that because honestly, her
significance again cannot be underestimated.
Her significance and her 54 years of respect
for this place.
Mm-hmm. Esperanza, I kid you not, this episode will stay with me.
Yeah, I agree. Since I read these words of hers, I haven't stopped thinking about them.
This episode will stay with me, and really, this was thank you for bringing.
Well, thank you to her for actually writing this and sharing it with us. Just
really beautiful. And on that note, before the tears damage my laptop, we better sign up. Fantastic stuff. Thank you, Esperanza.
Right, Irwin. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for joining us. New episodes of Our Hamptons are released every other Tuesday. Find them wherever you get your podcasts.